Well, I'm going to start.
Right.
So welcome, everybody, and I am honored and humbled that you came. Welcome to everybody. I see George Abrams just came. Today we're going to talk about an American original. His name is Thomas Merton. In religious life at the monastery of Gethsemane in Kentucky, he was called Father Lewis. Back in the days when you entered religious life, you were given another name. When I entered the Carmelites and became a friar in 1965, I went from being Michael to Frater or Brother Simon. And much later on, just before I left, you were able to go back to your baptismal name, which most of us did. I like the name Simon. I was named for the first English Carmelite friar, Simon Stock, who brought the Carmelites to Aylesford in Kent, England, back in the 1200s. But today we're going to talk about Merton. And one of the things that would be an introduction to him, and Patrick, you can put up whatever one of the images you want to start with, is that a couple of years ago, I believe in 2015, Pope Francis came to the United States on his first and so far his only visit. And he was invited to address a joint session of Congress. And in his talk, he mentioned four great Americans, they turned out to be American Christians, whose lives continue to give people a sense of what we believe in, as well as who we are as a people. And Pope Francis summed up what he believed these four people offered to us today, if I can quote him. A nation can be considered great when it defends liberty, as Lincoln did, when it fosters a culture which enables people to dream of full rights for all their brothers and sisters, as did Martin Luther King Jr., when it strives for justice and the cause of the oppressed, as Dorothy Day did in her tireless work, the fruit of a faith which becomes dialogue and sows peace in the contemplative style of Thomas Merton. So you know that, of course, we have a holiday in which we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr., right? In January, it's coming up on us. And we celebrate his vision of justice and freedom. We don't have a day for Dorothy Day. Now, if you don't know who she is, Dorothy Day was a journalist very early in the 20th century. And in the 20th century, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And very early in the 20th century, she mostly covered social issues. So, for example, she covered the controversy about America getting into the First World War. She then had a kind of a breakthrough in her life. She had never been baptized. And when she was finally baptized, she decided that she needed to find a real vocation, a real way to frame her life. She had had a daughter with her lover, who then left her when she got baptized. No good deed goes unpunished. And she met a man named Peter Morin, who was a kind of a social idealist living in a church rectory on the Lower East Side. He convinced her that she had the writing skills and the organizational and administrative gifts to help set up a house of hospitality. And the idea would be that in this house of hospitality, you would be able to give people temporary shelter, feed them, maybe connect them with medical care, maybe even connect them with jobs. And so that's what they did. And for the next 50 years of her life, until she died in the late 1980s, Dorothy Day lived in several houses of hospitality on the Lower East Side. And every couple of weeks in the Catholic Worker newspaper, she wrote a column and she talked about, the needs of people. This was a time, of course, of the Great Depression in the 20s and into the 30s. But, toward the end of her life, she was out here in California protesting with Cesar Chavez, and she and a whole bunch of other women protesters were arrested and even imprisoned. She was already in her middle 80s when this happened, but she was proud of the fact that she had been arrested back when she was 22 years old for the first time for protesting. So she was a woman of fire and passion. And so it's interesting that the Pope chooses to mention in his talk to the Congress not only Lincoln, not only Martin Luther King Jr., to whom we need no introduction, but also Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. And by the way, Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton corresponded quite a bit, and she published a number of his articles in her newspaper, The Catholic Worker. Merton himself was born in 1915 in southern France. His father was from New Zealand, who was a painter. His mother was from the United States, in fact, from Queens, New York. They both died when he was still a child. He had one younger brother, a brother 5 years younger than he. His mother died first of cancer, and then his father died a few years later on. So Merton spent, from the time he was about 8 or 9 years old, in the care of other relatives, both in England and then in France, and then finally in Douglaston, Queens, New York. He was brilliant. He went to what they call a public school in England, which is actually a private preparatory school, from which he was able to be enrolled and accepted at the University of Cambridge. And at the University of Cambridge, while he showed brilliance in his essays that he wrote for his tutors, he ran around with a lot of different women and drank a lot and had a great old time, to the extent that finally the person who was in charge of him, one of his relatives, said, "Enough of this, Tom," and disenrolled him from Cambridge and sent him over to Columbia University in New York to live not on campus at first, but to live with his uncle and his uncle's wife and family out in Queens, and then commute in on the subways. That happened in the 30s. And Merton also succeeded as a scholar and a student at Columbia. He also drank a lot and chased a lot of girls. He also made friends with an amazing group of people who were in his class. The painter Ad Reinhardt, the poet Robert Lax, several others who were activists and business people. He was a favorite student of Charles Van Doren, who was related to the famous Mark Van Doren of fame with the $64,000 question back in the 1950s in TV. He was a scholar of William Blake. He wrote his master's paper on Blake, and he was going to do his doctoral dissertation on Gerard Manley Hopkins, the Jesuit priest and poet. But somehow he made a visit to the monastery in Kentucky one Advent and decided this was going to be the life for him. This came out of nowhere. His friends back in New York, with whom he used to visit the saloons and stuff, they were of the opinion that he had some kind of nervous breakdown, and in fact urged him to, pass on this. But the fact of the matter is that he was determined to try out his vocation. And the day after Pearl Harbor, in December of 1941, he entered as a postulant into the Trappist monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane in Kentucky. And he lived there until he died. In fact, he didn't die there, but he died at a conference in Bangkok, Thailand, in April of 1968. He had a career which was very unusual for a monk. The Trappists are a very strict order. They're in the Benedictine family, but during the years that he was a Trappist, they had silence most of the time and even used a form of sign language to talk. Merton's skill as a writer was recognized right away by the abbot, the head of the monastery, who immediately assigned him to do a historical book on the monastery. and then to start doing historical essays on various saints of the Cistercian order. And then he was asked by the same superior if he could start writing on things regarding the spiritual life, start to advise people on prayer, on meditation, on reading the scriptures. During the 10 years, first 10 years he was there, one of the things that happened is that they put him through a theological education in preparation for him to be ordained a deacon and then a priest, obviously also alongside being a monk. He was never going to have a parish to work at, but he would have a ministry, and in fact, a ministry that reached millions of people and still continues to do so through his books. Almost everything Thomas Merton published in terms of books and articles are still in print. I of course hesitate to say that because for many people today, reading is an online or an electronic phenomenon. But his books have never gone out of print. There is an International Thomas Merton Society. There are Merton societies in the UK and in various other countries. People continue to write about him. I think if you put together all the books and articles written by him, you'd have to build an addition onto the Bellarmine University Library. And by the way, the Bellarmine University Library in Louisville, where Tom Cassidy went to school and is a proud alum, is where the Thomas Merton Archives, the Thomas Merton Center, is located there. And I have been privileged to meet the director, be shown some of his manuscripts, be shown some of his own private books, personal books that are there. And of course, I've been, as I mentioned before we started today, out to the Hermitage where Merton lived the last 4 or 5 years of his life, a small cinder block building with a little chapel in it that he lived in, and where he had guests visiting him, and where he wrote most of the things in the last 4 or 5 years of his life. Probably he wrote throughout his lifetime 70 books, hundreds of articles, and he did all of this in a little bit less than 20 years. If you can imagine the productivity, what would he have been able to produce if he had a word processor or a computer on which to store his files? He was a notoriously bad, his handwriting was horrendous. So when he would sketch out his notes, he used to have to train one of the younger monks to decipher his writings and then to type up. You know, since he was a writer and this was his work at the monastery, he was assigned a couple of the younger monks to actually be his secretaries and to type up his manuscripts as he revised them. Those of you who went to school before the electronic era, I'm sure Patrick will remember this from law school, and the rest of us will remember it from all of our educations. I mean, we would write papers and then have to correct them. And this was before the days of an automatic correction ball on your IBM typewriter or the whiteout stuff. So there was a lot of extra work involved. Now it's a lot easier to edit your stuff online, as I can tell you, being an author myself. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes and then sort of, you know, try to summarize in the end why Merton is continues to be important to us. So one of the things he said, he wrote this to Dorothy Day in the early 1960s. Merton said, persons are not known by intellect alone, not by principles alone, but only by love. It is when we love the other one, the one who is our enemy, that we obtain from God the key to an understanding of who God really is and who we really are. It is only this realization that can open us up to the real nature of our duty and our action and our lives. Our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy of our love. That's not our business. And in fact, it's no one's business. What we are asked to do is to love. And this love itself will render both ourselves and our neighbors worthy, if anything can. One of the things that made me love Thomas Merton is that when he was out in his hermitage, one of the things he actually said to a bunch of visitors when they came to him and said, next time, what can we bring you? His answer was beer. I've always loved beer. I drink whatever beer I can get my hands at. And so if you love me and care for me, the next time you come, you'll bring some beer for us to enjoy together. By the way, I should tell you that he also enjoyed good whiskey, and he was in the right state for this, of course, being in Kentucky, which is a wonderful place for bourbon. When he was living in his hermitage, he wrote an article at the request of a journalist friend of his in Argentina, and he wrote it and titled it Day of a Stranger, El Dia de Extraño. And he says about his life, this is not a hermitage, it's a house. Who was that hermitage I seen you with last night? What I wear is pants. What I do is live. How I pray is breathe. Who said Zen? Wash out your mouth if you said Zen. If you see a meditation going by, shoot it. Who said love? Love's in the movies. The spiritual life is something that people worry about when they are so busy with something else and think that they ought to be spiritual. Spiritual life that way is guilt. For me, up here in the woods is seen the New Testament. That is to say, the wind comes through the trees and you breathe it. Is it supposed to be clear? I'm not inviting anybody to try my life or suggesting that one day the message will come saying now. That's none of my business. In an age where there is so much talk about being yourself, I reserve to myself the right to forget about being myself, since in any case, there is very little chance of my being someone else. Rather, it seems to me that when one is too intent on being himself or herself, he or she runs the risk of impersonating a shadow. Life consists in learning to live one's own spontaneous, freewheeling life. To do this, one must recognize what is one's own, to be familiar and at home with oneself. This means basically learning who one is and learning what one has to offer to the contemporary world, and then learning how to make that offer valid. One last quote. This is from one of his most famous books, The New Seeds of Contemplation, that he first wrote in 1949, and then he revised several times, hence New Seeds of Contemplation. But it also shows you a gentler side. You can get a little bit of his vivacity. I mean, his eyes were always described as twinkling. 5 minutes with him, you felt like you knew him all your life. But he says here, a tree gives glory to God by being a tree. For in being what God means it to be, it is obeying him. It consents, so to speak, to his creative force. It is expressing an idea which is in God and which is not distinct from the essence of God, and which therefore a tree imitates God by being a tree. The forms and individual characters of living and growing things, of inanimate beings, of animals, and all of nature constitute their holiness in the sight of God. Their inscape is their sanctity. It is the imprint of God's wisdom and his reality in them. The special clumsy beauty of this particular colt on this April day, in this field, under these clouds, is a holiness consecrated to God by his own creative wisdom, and it declares the glory of God. The pale flowers of the dogwood outside this window, the little yellow flowers that no one notices on the side of the road, all of these are saints looking up into the face of God. For me to be a saint means to be myself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and discovering my true self. Now, I hope those words, I realize it's a lot to listen to, but I hope those words give you a little flavor and maybe suggest to you why still today people are discovering him for the first time. I was first introduced to his work at the ripe old age of 13 in my first year in the minor seminary. And so I am going to be 74 shortly. So I have been reading Thomas Merton for over 60 years, and I have never regretted any of the time I spent in reading him, or now having written maybe 15 or 20 articles about him. He's a hero to me. Now, I wonder, Patrick, could you show some of the images that I sent you of Merton? And then we can have some time if people want to ask questions or talk. Most of these are just going to be pictures of him. I decided to not try to show you all his friends or a lot of the other places, but I decided to just show you something of what he looked like. And I think you can pick up, if we can get to see them, something of the openness of his personality in his space. Hi, Angela. Okay, this is my favorite picture of him. It was taken by his good friend, a famous writer who did that famous book, Black Like Me, where he actually got the dermatologist to inject him with pigment so that he would look like a black man, and he shaved his head. And then for several months, he experienced what it was like to live as a black man in the segregated South. This was in the late 1950s. That man's name was John Howard Griffin. Because of his book and because of his interest as a writer, Merton became a very close friend of his. John Howard Griffin was also an extremely talented photographer. And this picture is taken in Thomas Merton's Hermitage. I think there'll be some that will show you a little bit more of it. It's my favorite picture of him. He is only about 50 years old at this point. He lived a hard life. They fasted a lot in those days in the monastery. He also worked very hard to produce in less than 25 years over 70 books and hundreds of articles. You know that the man, in addition to the hours of prayer in church, took it seriously, the idea of Saint Benedict, that to work is to pray, ora et labora. And so, you know, even his friends, when they saw him later in life, were kind of shocked at how weathered and how, while healthy, his body seemed to show the consequences of working a lot and not eating a lot. How about another one, Patrick, if you can?
You have that one?
Yeah.
Did he write anything about his experiences of being Black?
John Howard Griffin wrote a book called Black Like Me.
That's
It's
what
still,
I thought you said. Okay.
Yeah, it's still in print, and it's very powerful because he got spit on, he was threatened, he was thrown off of buses, thrown out of lunch counters. He experienced exactly what a Black person experiences. You know, today we say that you're guilty of walking down the street Black. You're guilty of driving a car while Black. You're guilty of wearing a hoodie while Black. I mean, people sometimes think that this is comedy, but in fact, it's a horrible description of the racism that still exists today, and how many young Black men will have to be shot, not just by police officers, but by others, as a result of that. So, yeah.
Thank
Do you have
you.
another? Do you have another one, Patrick?
I do.
Okay.
You should have another one up by now.
Not yet.
There seems to be a little bit of lag.
Okay. Yeah.
There should be a picture up of him in front of what I think is the Hermitage.
Okay. Yeah. It's not up yet, though.
I'll retry.
All right. Try again.
Share.
Toward the end of his life, when there was a new abbot or head of the monastery, he was allowed to do some traveling. And he came out to the West Coast, visited his friend, the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, up in San Francisco. Yes, this is his hermitage. You see, it's a very plain, simple cinder block building. And when it was first put up, the only heat in it was his fireplace, and he had to go outside. He had to go outside to an outhouse to go to the bathroom, and he had to carry water from a nearby well, bring it inside, and if he wanted it warm to bathe himself, he had to heat it up on a little stove. There was no electricity. There was no, not a septic tank. In time, he moved out to this hermitage in 1965. In time, they did bring electricity out there because it's not far from the monastery. You can walk there in probably 10 minutes or so. And they also installed, a toilet and running water. And they got him a stove, a gas stove. They put the gas tank outside. So the last couple of years that he was there, he was able to actually have a little bit more comfortable life and actually make himself some food. Once a day, usually in the middle of the morning, he would go down to the monastery and they would have their daily liturgy, their daily Eucharist around 10:30, 11 o'clock. He would be at that, participate in that. And then it was an arrangement that the abbot made him abide by. He would then go and have the main meal of the day, a hot meal, with the rest of the monks. Usually there was reading during the meal. You didn't have conversations. And then he would be given food to take back to the hermitage to make for supper. So for example, they would give him bread. They baked their own bread. They would give him cheese. They used to make their own wonderful cheese. And then he would be given soup and other things to eat. Yes, Carrie, you want to put another one up, Patrick, if you could, while I'm answering Carrie? Yep. Okay, this is him teaching. One of the things that he did for almost the entire time he was at Gethsemane Abbey is that because he already had advanced degrees, he was appointed to be the head teacher of the student monks and the head of the novices. So for the first, I would say, after he made his profession and was ordained in 1948, from 1949 on until probably 1959 or 60, he was the head of the novices. But then alongside of that, he and several other monks were the teachers of the student monks, and he continued to teach the student monks all the way through till the end of his life. He even came in every day, I believe, not every day, but 2 days a week, and gave a class. And so you see him here surrounded by the student monks. The guys who just have the white hood, you see one right in the foreground and one over on the other side, they are novices. So only when you finish the novitiate do you then get the black scapular and the black hood, like Thomas Merton is wearing here, and like some of the other student monks. But you can see how young these guys are, Once I was a student friar like this too. I should also tell you that, for church, the Trappists then on top of this wore a big white, they call it a cowl. So it is a very full cassock with big sleeves and a hood at the back of that too. the original idea of this was to keep you warm in churches that had no heat. And when Thomas Merton first went to Gethsemane, there was no heat in the building whatsoever. And you know what it's like in Kentucky in the winter. It's not exactly toasty. Any more pictures? Carrie, while he's getting the next picture up, you wanted to say something? Okay. I'll go through the pictures and I'll come back. So this is the year before he died. And this is one of the pictures where one of his old Columbia University friends said, wow, he's looking old. I don't think he's looking particularly old. I mean, he was here about 52 years old. But as I said before, the life there was hard. And he, in turn, had the personality, a type A personality. He was very hard on himself. And it's not like that he did any kind of extreme fasting. He ate what was put in front of him. But he also had a number of health issues. He had probably what was not diagnosed then, but irritable bowel syndrome. He had a number of allergies. His skin was very sensitive, so he used to have to cover up his hands with gloves during the winter because his hands got so chapped and raw. So he had a hard life. One of his friends, his closest friends from Columbia days, said that Tom was always energetic and doing more than he needed to do. And I guess that becoming a monk didn't do anything to change that. How about another one, Patrick?
Just a moment.
If you Google Thomas Merton, you will find a lot of his writings online. Not all of them, but excerpts of them. So if you want to taste a little bit more about him, learn a little bit more about his life, there's a lot of Thomas Merton online. Just Google him. Okay, the guy putting a special scarf around the cross on Merton's grave, you might recognize is the Dalai Lama.
Right.
Because when on his last trip to Asia in 1968, when Merton went over there, one of the things that was arranged for him is to have a brief hour meeting with the Dalai Lama. Well, they hit it off so well that they continued to meet for 3 more days. They really hit it off and were friends and continued to they didn't continue to correspond because 2 months later, Merton was dead. He died on December the 10th of 1968. But he visited, the Dalai Lama did, Gethsemane Abbey about 10 years ago. The man to his right there, he's wearing the cowl that the monks wear when they're in church for services. He invited him there for a special conference, Monasticism East and West. And the monk who's standing over to the left is my good friend, now deceased, Merton's last secretary, Brother Patrick Hart, who was a graduate of Notre Dame, who got his bachelor's degree and master's degree at Notre Dame, was a Holy Cross brother there, and who taught literature in high school, and then came to become a Trappist monk in 1950 or 51. A wonderful man. He edited several of the volumes of Merton's journals. He edited 4 or 5 different collections of essays about Merton. He was an absolute wonderful guy. I do remember one time a friend of mine, another priest, and I went down to do a retreat there. And we said, Patrick, we want to take you out to dinner. And we did, and boy, what a dinner we had. This man could put the food away and the beer too. Wonderful man. I really miss him. He's somebody that used to call me after they were done with the morning prayers and before he started doing the mail, because he was the abbot's secretary. And he used to call me at 6:15. He would tell me what day of the week he was going to call me. And so we would be on the phone for a half an hour or something like that. I miss him a lot. Any more pictures? Okay, so this is back in late October of 1968. There's Merton on the left, and there's a much younger Dalai Lama on the right. And as I said, the two of them hit it off famously. They understood each other. Because the Dalai Lama spoke enough English that he could not only understand Merton, but when it came to prayer and when it came to, understanding how one tried to grow in the spiritual life, this a Christian on the left and Buddhist on the right had no problem understanding each other. And many years later, of course, the Dalai Lama was encouraged to write about Merton, and he did. And he even wrote a book about Jesus of Nazareth that he dedicated to his good friend, Father Louis or Thomas Merton. And I had the privilege several years ago when the Dalai Lama visited the Buddhist monastery in Wappingers Falls, New York, where my parish was. I was privileged to go over there and visit him. And I even had a rosary, a Buddhist rosary that I had him. He wouldn't bless it, but he simply took it and put his hands. This is the last picture of Merton. This is the taken at the conference in Bangkok, Thailand. The conference after Merton's talk, which he is presenting here, the morning session of the conference ended at noontime. They went and had lunch, after which Merton went back to his room to take a shower. And when he got out of the shower and reached for the fan, he was electrocuted because it had a shot. It was shorted out, and he died of the electrocution, probably a heart attack. There was a doctor who was a monk who came and saw the body within maybe 20 minutes of his dying, and who gave a preliminary diagnosis that in fact, it was a shock. He could see the marks of the burns. So a terrible way to die, only 53 years old. Who knows what he would have been able to do had he lived longer. Okay, Carrie, what did you want to ask, please?
Unmute yourself, Carrie.
There was a huge helicopter that went over, so I muted. That was wonderful, wonderful, Michael. It was just very precious and special. I had understood that Thomas Merton had to get special permission from his order to live in the Hermitage.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, because generally speaking, the Benedictines are Cenobites. That is to say, they live together, eat together, sleep in the same building, they're not hermits. He argued for years, though, that the hermit vocation was a very ancient one. And he particularly argued with his longtime abbot, Father James Fox, who, by the way, was a graduate of Harvard Business School and who was one who got the Trappist business of cheese making and fruitcake making. Fruitcake they still make, cheese they don't make anymore. He was a big business guy, and of course his cash cow was this wonderful monk whose books kept being bestsellers. And in fact, as Brother Patrick told me one time, he said, we wouldn't be still here if it weren't for Tom's books. But he finally relented. And the funny thing about it is that after he allowed Merton to go start living in the Hermitage, after 20 years of being the master of the novices and the head teacher of all the student monks, he figured he earned it after 20 years. A Harvard MBA would think that way. 2 years later, James Fox retired from being the abbot, and guess what he did? He had a hermitage made for him, a much nicer hermitage, and he lived toward the end, till the end of his life, in another hermitage on the property there in Trappist, Kentucky. The town that, or the postal name of the monastery is Trappist, Kentucky, with the zip code. I'm trying to think. New Hope is actually the closest town. I walked 2/3 of the way to New Hope once. Yeah, New Hope, and then I can't remember what the other ones are. Bardstown is a ways off. It's about 20 minutes, half an hour to Bardstown. But Thomas Merton knew all the bars between Bardstown and the monastery. Whenever he had a friend, they would go and stop at a bar. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, you'll find this funny, but several years ago, we were attending a basketball game, and at that point in time, the big heads were very popular.
Yes.
And your favorite picture of Thomas Merton was the big head up in the crowd.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you
I-
sent me a picture of that.
I sent
think-
that to you, Michael.
you-
I was trying to find it here and I cannot find. I've got
Yes.
way too many pictures, but only a Jesuit college would have a big head of
That's
Thomas
right.
Merton
That's
to
right. That's
scare off
absolutely.
the free throws.
That's right. That's right. They put Martin's head up there to.
That was so
They
fun.
there actually is a statue of Merton on the campus, and it shows him. It's based on a photograph when he is walking through a field, and he has a camera in one hand and a book in the other hand. You know, and so yeah, he
We've
looks
seen it.
like he's actually in motion. Yeah.
Right.
He's got a big grin on his face. The man is almost always smiling. I mean, here, you know, this is again John Howard Griffin. He's sitting inside. This is inside the main room in the Hermitage. And I'm sure Griffin said, look like you're studious. Look like you're a scholar. Look like you're thinking deep thoughts. I'm sure that's what he said to him. And so Merton is trying to do that, but you can see the little bit of the little bit of a smile on his face. Apparently the man had an absolutely wild sense of humor. Jim Forrest, who is a longtime peace activist and writer, met Thomas Merton when Jim was only about 20 years old, right after he got out of the Navy. And when he went down there, he said that Merton had the two of them laughing so hard that they ended up on the floor because they were telling each other stories, you know. And he said he always thought this guy was so serious. And he produced these wonderful books on prayer, but when you met him in real life, he was laughing and a real human being. And I think if you read, I tried to pick a couple of quotes that captured that. I mean, and I think they do. I hope they do. And if you want me to send you the text of that, I can send you the text of that. Just, you know, write me an email and I'll do that. But as I say, just Google Thomas Merton online. You'll find a ton of stuff. In fact, the Thomas Merton Center and the International Thomas Merton Society both have websites. And on it, there are pictures of him, a biography of him, a list of all of his writings. If you want me to, I can send that to you, send the links to you as well. Anybody else?
Well,
We got
Michael,
time.
you quoted a Spanish phrase there, and I thought I'd give you a short Spanish lesson. The pronunciation is El Día del Extranjero.
Extranjero. Okay. The Day of the Stranger, right? I
Right.
mean, yeah, my reading of Spanish is better than my speaking of it. It's very easy. It's interesting. Yesterday was the feast of Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, very famous Carmelite writer. Now that's isn't that a great picture?
Oh,
And
yeah,
he's
that's a good
standing right
picture.
outside the main building of the monastery. By the way, when he wasn't in church, once he moved to the Hermitage, that's what he wore. He wore a jean jacket, jeans, and a like a work shirt. You know, he said, this is what a monk in the 20th century ought to wear. I don't mind wearing the habit in church. Okay, it's like a vestment. It's like me and George. I don't know if you saw last Sunday, both of us wore our collars. I said to him, how about we dress up like real priests? And then he said, we are real priests. I said, well, next week, meaning this coming Sunday, we're going to be back to being country parsons. We're not going to be wearing our collars. The canon can wear our collar, but, you know, we're just going to be Michael and George, you know.
But do you have to be bald to be a real priest?
No, but
I
back
think thinning hair qualifies, George.
thinning hair. Well, obviously he had thinning hair, but in the early days that he was there, they actually used to do a tonsure. So in other words, they cut all the hair off except
Right.
for a little band of it around the side. Yeah, they
Right.
still did that. There's a picture in Jim Forrest's biography of him, of Merton sitting in the barber chair, and one of the other monks is giving him the buzz cut, you know, the monastic buzz cut. Yeah. Yeah, but he had thinning hair, so, you know, in the end, it didn't make any difference. Yeah.
The
They don't do
tonsure was very popular in the what, 1400s in England?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. In
Yeah.
fact, not only monks were tonsured, anybody who was ordained was tonsured, right? But what they did for the parish clergy is they just cut out a circle up here. I don't need that to be done to me anymore.
Hey, I found it.
Oh, okay.
I mean, darn.
Michael, do you
Yeah.
know today what the number of people at the monastery is? I mean,
Yeah, they have about 45-ish or so, but of that 45, a dozen of them are elderly monks who are in they call it the seniorate. Okay. Oh yeah, there he is. See that, guys? We got a big Merton face there.
The Thomas Merton big head
Right.
at a Bellarmine basketball game.
Well, Thomas Merton is to the left and Pope Francis is to the right.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, they couldn't leave out the Pope.
They couldn't leave out the Pope.
Yeah,
because the Pope,
so, yeah,
when
there's
the Pope
Merton.
came here, who does he mention besides Abe Lincoln and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day? He mentions Thomas Merton.
all right.
And by the way, I should tell you that there are conservative Catholics who feel that Thomas Merton was not a good example of Catholic priesthood or theology because he was too liberal, too radical, too much involved with the world. Also a friend of the Asian religious traditions, which he studied intensely and reached out to, not only to the Buddhists, by the way, but also to the Sufis, to the Sufi Muslims, who in fact are the Muslims who are the closest to Christianity. And there's good reason for that because they actually learned a lot from the desert monks in Arabia and in Egypt. Yeah.
Those same conservative Catholics don't like Pope Francis either.
Of course they don't. That's exactly right. And there are conservative Episcopalians and Anglicans who also don't like Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori, or for that matter, Bishop Michael Curry. And anybody who reaches out to the world and anybody who is joyful is somehow problematic or a threat. Religion has to be,
Well, Michael, that was a great presentation.
Oh, he's
Thank
a
you very
great
much.
guy. I encourage you to go look up his stuff. He is readable. Some of his books, I will say, are a little dense, but when at the end of his life, he did a self-evaluation and analysis of his books. I think only thought that there were 2 or 3 of them that he would recommend to other people. But Seeds of Contemplation would be one of them in particular. And actually, some of the best collections are the ones that have a bunch of his essays. There's, I think, Contemplation in a World of Action. And I think there's another one called Contemplative Prayer. Those are really very good. He is a good teacher. He doesn't just, pour it onto you, but he challenges you to think yourself. Like, for example, when he writes about the fact that if you want to be a saint, like the flowers are saints, like the plants are saints, like the animals are saints because they can't be anything else than they are, well, take a lesson from them. Who is he quoting there? Think of the lilies of the
Saint
field
Francis.
and the birds of the air, and St. Francis, the Lord Jesus himself and St. Francis. So be who you are. Don't try to be somebody else. And, most of us realize that a lot of time is spent in therapy trying to disabuse ourselves of being somebody else,
That's also Moses. I
Catherine.
am who I am.
I am who I am, yeah.
St. Catherine
And
of Siena.
St. Catherine of Siena too, and St. John of the Cross, whose day was yesterday, who says essentially, God is always going to give you a dark night. Don't think that somehow you are singled out to have times of uncertainty or suffering. This is a part of life. And those of us, I think I can say safely, everybody who's on this Zoom today has lived long enough to know the truth of that. You don't get out of this without a bit of suffering, but the suffering makes you more of a human being. The suffering teaches you how to forgive. The suffering teaches you to be compassionate. We don't necessarily start off life compassionate. My 7-year-old grandson is not compassionate. I remember when my kids were little, they were not compassionate, you know. My tutor in the University of Copenhagen always used to say to me when we were studying original sin, Arvesund in Danish, he used to say to me, "You got kids?" I said, "Well, not yet." He said, "Well, when you have them, you'll understand where the doctrine of original sin comes from." And I remembered that when my son was born, and yeah.
Well, you were talking about how his hermitage and it was heated with a fireplace. Is that what
Yeah,
you said?
fireplace. Yeah.
Cold Kentucky nights. We can attest to that.
Oh, yeah.
We went down to an event at Bellarmine and they put us up in what used to be the priest's dormitory.
Dormitory, yeah.
And it was February and they forgot to turn on the heat. I'm surprised we don't have 10 children after that night. We were freezing.
I was just going to say,
Never been so cold inside a building in
Yep.
my life.
Yep.
So I
Yep.
can't imagine just heating that little concrete thing with even with a fireplace. He had to have been cold, but
oh, yeah. Yeah.
we were cold. Never been that cold.
In one of my books, the one that's called Saints as They Really Are, I have a fairly long chapter on my 10 years in the Carmelites. And I have some pictures like of the outside of the novitiate monastery and the place where I went to junior seminary, right? But I do remember around the time that I was first reading, a little bit after I had started reading Merton. So I had graduated from the minor seminary, which is a preparatory high school, and I was a novice. In those days, as soon as you graduated from high school, if you wanted to go on and they accepted you, you became brother so-and-so, frater so-and-so. And the novitiate was up in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and it was on the property of Sinclair Lewis, the famous Minnesota writer, you know, Main Street and Elmer Gantry and all that. It was on the property of his estate, and there was the estate house, and then they built a cinder block addition to it that had a chapel, a dining room downstairs, a library, little library, and a classroom upstairs, and then our rooms or cells. And it was just cinder block, unpainted cinder block. And of course, that's Western Massachusetts. It gets real cold in the winter. And we supposedly had heat, but I can tell you that what most of us used to have to do, because we didn't have anybody to snuggle with, is put not only every blanket, but almost every other piece of clothing that you had on top of you to keep yourself warm at night. So I didn't mind putting on my habit in the morning. And I do remember putting the hood up too, because it was chilly. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else?
You really make it possible for us to get inside those hermitage places and at the dinner table or supper table in the bars eating with Thomas Merton. It was really a pleasure dining with you today.
I would love to have met him, and if you want to read my little chapter, I think I've excerpted that, so I think I could send you that file. My daughter, when she read the first draft of it, said C-. And I said, what? You know, she said, Dad, you talk about the whole thing in the third person. There's nothing of you in this. And I had a breakthrough because I realized that when I grew up, I don't know, probably you too, nobody cared what I thought. Nobody cared what I felt. You know, you were supposed to be there, minding your manners, taking the orders, and it's certainly that the Carmelite friars who taught us gave us an exceptional education, and they were, for the most part, wonderful people. But it really was another world and another culture and another consciousness. And I said, bingo, Hannah. I said, you put your finger on why when I tried to recall that time, I went back and became again the person I was, when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, and in that minor seminary, you know. And the same was true. I used to get into big trouble with the novice master up in Williamstown, you know, because I actually talked back to him and asked questions and told him that sometimes what he told me was off the wall. And so as a result of that, for the daily work periods, he had me stripping and waxing all of the staircases. And when that was not enough to shut me up, he threw me into the kitchen, and I started at one end of it and polished all cleaned and wiped down all the stainless steel on the dishwasher, on the refrigerators, on everything else. And then when I was done, I reported to him and he said, start all over again.
So nothing's changed. Eloise is gonna have you cleaning the pews next year.
No. I should warn Bishop Susan, that's what she's in for with me, so.
I'll let her be surprised.
Yeah. Well, Jeannie says, you know, you may not want to do this, but it's not a bad thing to marry an ex-monk.
She would know.
Everybody
She
have
would
a great
know.
day.
You guys have a
Hi.
wonderful day. Let me just conclude with a prayer. And this is from the Book of Common Prayer, which celebrated Thomas Merton last week. Let us pray. Gracious God, you called your monk, Thomas, to proclaim your justice out of silence, and you moved him in his contemplative writings to perceive and to value Christ at work in the faiths of others. Keep us then, like him, steadfast in the knowledge and love of Jesus Christ, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.